Well, the next presentation is a very topical one. Beattie talks to Michael Pettis, who is a finance professor at Peking University, on what is really on the China agenda. Ian, over to you.
Thank you, Tumi, and good morning, everyone. Welcome to the session I've been looking forward to the most, as it's so topical, and the professor here is most qualified to talk about it. He is the one with the indie rock band titles behind him, by the way. I'm the one with the books, just to keep you sharp. Michael, suddenly everyone is talking about common prosperity. That's if they're not claiming China is toxic or President Xi hates private enterprise. Why is this? What does it mean exactly? And perhaps you could put it into context for us and tell us what it means for investors.
Yes, I think common prosperity is, in a way, it's the same old story we've been hearing for basically since 2007. What's new about it, I think, is a recognition of what the real problem in China is. As you know, China has a very low consumption share of GDP, not because Chinese don't like to consume, but because Chinese households retain a very low share of GDP. In Europe and in the US, for example, households retain about 75–80% of GDP. Even in low consuming countries in Asia, it's around 60–70% of GDP. In China, it's a little bit over 50% of GDP. So it's extremely low because they retain a low share of GDP. Households do. So as a result, China has had to depend really heavily on investment to generate growth, to absorb everything it produces. And for a couple of decades, that was a great model because China was hugely underinvested relative to its level of development. But in the past 15 years, 10 to 15 years, China has become relatively overinvested given its ability to absorb investment. And as a result, we've seen a lot of non-productive investment, which means a surge in debt. Because when you borrow $100 and invest it in a product that produces $110, debt goes up, but your debt leverage goes down. In China, you borrow $100 and invest it in something that generates $20 worth of wealth or $30, and so your debt's growing much faster than your GDP. So how do you resolve this? Well, you've got to bring all this non-productive investment down. And China's been talking about this for over a decade. But the problem is that with consumption so low, if you bring investment down, then growth slows significantly. So they've been talking about rebalancing income for years, rebalancing demand for years, which means increasing consumption so that you can lower your reliance on investment, much of which is non-productive investment. The problem is that you can't simply increase consumption by announcing that you're going to increase consumption. There's only two ways to increase the consumption share of GDP. One way is to increase household debt, which is not really sustainable, but that's what China did in the last 5 to 7 years. And the other way is to increase the household share of GDP. But increasing the household share means reducing somebody else's share, and that's why it's always been very difficult. So for years, they've talked about rebalancing demand towards consumption, but they didn't do anything. We're basically where we were. We're actually worse off than we were in 2007. We're better off than we were in 2010, which was the bottom. But only marginally better off. So what common prosperity seems to mean is a formal recognition that if you want to increase consumption, then you have to redistribute income. The problem with common prosperity is that they are focusing on the same consumption problem or distribution problem that we have in the US and Europe and South Africa and other countries, and that is income inequality. What the Chinese are saying is we must take money from the rich and have them donate it to the poor. That's sort of a weird aspect. It's called tertiary distribution of the Chinese model. And that'll solve the problem. But it won't solve the problem because the real problem is that governments retain a very large share. And that's why households retain such a small share. So if you really want to resolve the problem, you have to switch income from governments to the household sector, which I suspect is politically very tough to do. But until then, at least they're focusing on income redistribution, and that's what common prosperity is about.
Thank you, Michael. That's really very interesting, putting these, what might appear to be specific policy responses into the broader macro context and the broader challenge that China's faced. So China's come a long way, though, hasn't it? As you said there, both in the last few years, but perhaps over a longer term, in increasing consumption. It's been probably the most important consumption story globally over the last few years. But as you say, it's probably been more at the higher income level area. Is there anything else that you think they can do to do this? I'm wondering about, as you say, reducing the share of government, but possibly also exchange rates. Your low exchange rate, which probably was in the past and less so now, does really favor corporates over consumers, doesn't it?
Yes. If you depreciate the currency, you're basically transferring income from households who have to now pay more for imports to exporters, to the tradable goods sector, to manufacturers, and that makes things worse. That's why an appreciating currency has always been part of the central bank's plan. They want the currency to appreciate as part of the rebalancing. But it's interesting because you mentioned that consumption is a really great story in China. In a way it is, but not because the imbalances have improved, but simply because China was growing so quickly. So while China was growing at 10%, household income was growing at 7%, which is pretty rapid growth. And so consumption was growing at roughly 7%. But you notice that the consumption share of GDP continues to contract. And now as GDP growth slows, they need to raise the consumption share, which means consumption growth won't slow as much as GDP growth if they get it right.
Oh, okay. So you don't think they can rely on the wealth effect, meaning that there'll be more wealthier people who will then spend proportionately more on consumption, as we've seen in other development, as other countries go through development, we've seen in some of the more successful ones, and obviously haven't seen in the less successful ones.
Right. The problem is it's a minor problem. It's a much bigger problem in the U.S., Europe, and in the West generally. But the problem is that even within that household income, the rich have a very, very high share. And what we know about the rich is they don't tend to consume a very large share of their income. They save most of it. So China has an excess savings problem, and common prosperity is a way of addressing this. But as I would argue, it's solving the minor problem. It's not solving the big problem.
Okay, so that's a very interesting couple of points there, Michael, and so I'm itching to explore both of them. I'm not sure we've got time. There is, of course, the capital account that this might have implications for, because that's another way of making this equation balance. But I suppose also, there's a number of areas we could go into here as well on the consumption side. So, but maybe the capital account implications of this.
The capital account is a really interesting story because basically China has had capital controls since 1949. But in the last few years, they've been removing these capital controls. It's now very easy for foreigners to invest in the onshore markets. And so the big question is, why are they doing this, and what are the potential consequences? I think the reason they're doing this is because in 2014, 2015, you'll remember, China suffered from massive capital outflows, and we saw a roughly $1 trillion reduction in its reserves. And that really scared Beijing and the financial regulators. And so what they figured they needed to do was to encourage inflows so they wouldn't have this problem with massive outflows. So since then, they've been removing restrictions on capital inflows. And as a result, we saw a surge of inflows into China. As you know, Chinese government bonds have a very high rate of return, a very high yield. And the currency, because so much money is coming into China, the currency is unlikely to weaken. So it's become, in fact, yesterday they announced that for the 32nd month in a row, we've seen record inflows into the bond markets. We've also seen major inflows into the equity markets. That's going to continue. And I would argue that it makes a lot of sense to buy government bonds. Equity is a riskier thing because you've got to get your politics right. But it makes a lot of sense to buy government bonds. So I think this is going to continue, and I think the bond market will do well for at least another year or so. But the thing we have to focus on, I think, is the classic developing country problem. And that is when you have a really rigid and essentially insolvent banking system, and a lack of flexibility within that system, held up basically by moral hazard, you have to worry about massive inflows that then become massive outflows. Right now, the inflows are not massive. For the size of the Chinese economy, they're still quite small, but they're growing very rapidly. And I would say after about a year or so of this, as investors, we should be very, very concerned about the ratio of total foreign inflows relative to whatever the protection is, which is typically we think of it as reserves. In other words, we have to watch out for an Asian crisis problem in a couple of years if this level of inflows continues.
Okay, thank you. Very important warning there, I think. Many people in the past have accused China of mercantilism, low exchange rate, just accumulating FX reserves, and then, as you say, even when they're getting scared when those reserves are dropping low. And of course, that's understandable. Do we think that this is a change in that sort of policy? Is that era over? Or is it just a new phase? Is there still some instincts like that left in there? Or was that wrong in the first place?
No, it's mercantilism, but it's a modern form of mercantilism. And that is that China has extraordinarily high savings rates, the highest in history, probably, certainly for any long period of time. Now, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, it depends. If you are a rapidly growing developing country and you are significantly underinvested and have insufficient domestic savings to meet those investment needs, which is the typical definition of a developing country, then a high domestic savings rate is exactly what the doctor ordered. And that was what China had in the 80s and 90s, very low levels of investment. So that high savings rate poured savings into investment, which caused growth to rise very rapidly, which caused household income to rise very rapidly. The problem is that China is now overinvested. So it's trying to reduce the investment rate. But as you know, the current account surplus is simply savings minus investment. So if you try to reduce investment without reducing savings, your current account surplus goes up. Now, maybe if you're Singapore, you can get away with this because it's too small to matter. But in the case of China, clearly the world cannot absorb a rising Chinese trade surplus. And China recognizes that. They're trying to bring the surplus down. They celebrate every time imports rise faster than exports. But the problem is that in order to do that, you've got to bring the savings rate down. And there's two ways you can bring three ways. You can allow unemployment to soar, which they don't want. You can allow debt to soar, which is what they've had to deal with. Or you can raise the consumption share of GDP by increasing household income. But that's the hard part, because as I said earlier, the way to increase household income requires transfers of income from the government sector, mostly local governments, to the household sector. And I think that's been politically very, very hard to accomplish. So it's all the same problem, different facets of the same problem.
Thank you very much. That was really very helpful again there. Any last comments on what investors should be doing? So as you say, it sounds very slightly bullish for maybe the currency, but definitely for the bond market. And maybe all to play for on the equity side, maybe some big winners and some big losers within it. Any comments there for the foot soldiers of global capitalism?
My comments are going to be a little bit depressing because what I will argue on the credit side and on the equity side It's that you've got to get your politics right, even more importantly than your credit analysis or your valuations analyses. And that's really hard to do because there's a complete lack of transparency in government policies. But nonetheless, there are going to be significant changes. I would say one thing that is likely to happen is that we are likely to see, as investment declines as a share of GDP, and they're determined to have that happen, Chinese consumption of industrial metals and cement and things like that has to go down. And of course, that'll have significant follow-on impacts on the rest of the developing world, particularly the developing world. So I think that's something to watch very closely. It's not easy for China to pull this off. But if they do what they want to do, we will see a significant reduction in investment, which means a significant reduction in property and in infrastructure and all of the things that implies for their imports of industrial metals, et cetera, et cetera. The other thing to watch very closely is food and agricultural, anything related to consumption. Because as they bring consumption up, for the first time in decades, Chinese consumption will actually grow faster than Chinese GDP as opposed to slower. And of course, with such a large economy like that of China, that has significant consequences for a whole variety of markets.
Thank you. And just a bit of a favorite question of mine, which I ask my team a lot frequently, is when we look back over the last period, what did we get wrong? Where did China surprise us in this case? And what are we likely to get wrong going forward? If we're going to be sitting back here in 5 years' time, and we'll look back and we'll have some things right, I'm sure, and some things maybe we didn't get so right. What's the risk? What's the one that we might not be hitting hard?
I think a lot of analysts don't understand the mechanics in China. So, for example, last year with COVID-19, most people argued that Chinese growth would be zero or negative for the year. In fact, it was 2.3%. I argued it would be 2 to 3 percentage points for the year. This year, people argued that Chinese growth would be between 8 and 10%. And I argued that it would probably be above 6%, maybe 7 on certain conditions, but not much more than that. And I think now everybody's moving in that direction. And I think the point is that you cannot think of investment in infrastructure or property as having its own dynamics. It's really a residual. Beijing wants to bring investment in those areas down as rapidly as possible. But when high quality growth, which is consumption, exports, and business investment, when that goes up, they'll bring down investment in property and infrastructure. And when high quality growth goes down, they'll bring up investment in infrastructure and property. So I think that's something that people consistently get wrong. They think those things are independent.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Michael. Very insightful, as always. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Ian and Michael, for a very interesting conversation.